Alright folks, this is take two. I was incorrectly configured there. So as I was saying in the previous post, let's say peace is not resignation, I don't usually do YouTube monologues because I like to play piano. And this is not a monologue, this is a reading, and for once not of my own writing. I've been known for kind of crankily insisting over and over again that people need to read this or that article of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy rather than arguing on Facebook, and I suspect you all don't read it, so here we go. Pacifism. We'll see how far we get today. I've got a bit of a cold, so this might just be a little bit of a warm-up. Pacifism is a commitment to peace and opposition to war. Our ordinary language allows a diverse set of beliefs and commitments to be held together under the general rubric of pacifism. This article will explain the family resemblance among the variety of pacifisms. It will locate pacifism within deontological and consequentialist approaches to ethics. It will consider diverse cultural and religious sources of pacifism, and it will consider and reply to objections to pacifism. Like we need those. The word pacifism is derived from the word pacific, which means peacemaking. Paca meaning peace and ficus meaning making. Modern usage has been traced to 1901 in Émile Artaud's usage of the French term pacifisme. But the basic commitment to peace is an old idea. Pacifist sentiment can be found, for example, in the West and early Christianity. Perhaps the most famous use of the word pacifism is found in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, where Jesus claims that the peacemakers are blessed. In this passage, the Greek word ironopoi is translated into Latin as pacifici, which means those who work for peace. The Greek ironopoi is derived from the Greek irene in conjunction with poiesis, to make. Philosophical discussions of pacifism have clarified the concept by distinguishing the more general commitment to nonviolence from a narrower anti-war position. A related term, nonviolentism, has been coined by Holmes to describe a position that goes beyond anti-war pacifism in its opposition to violence in arms. By the way, look up an article with a title that's similar to that phrase, To Destroy Domination in All Its Forms by Julia Tannenbaum. Pacifism has often been defined dialectically in relation to the idea of justified violence that is found in the Western just war tradition. Pacifism is often located on a continuum for assessing the morality of war that includes realism, just war theory, and pacifism. The fundamental question here is, can war be justified? I would be more interested in the general, can violence be justified? But indeed, there is an ongoing debate about the proper relation between just war theory and pacifism that focuses on the question of whether the just war theory begins with a pacifist presumption against war. Some authors have used the just war theory to derive a version of pacifism described as contingent pacifism or just war pacifism. Authors such as Cheney Ryan and Robert Holmes more strongly maintain that the just war framework is flawed. Holmes argues that the just war tradition typically ignores the central moral issue in war, which is about the presumptive immorality of the massive, systematic, and deliberate killing of human beings that occurs in war. Ryan argues that although the just war tradition and pacifism developed through mutual critique, pacifism has often been marginalized as an outcast tradition. And yet the pacifist tradition includes a robust historical dialogue involving important authors and movements. Some have tried to distinguish pacificism from pacifism, where pacificism is a commitment to peace and peacefulness that is not strictly opposed to war, while pacifism is a more principled or absolute rejection of violence. But this distinction is not widely accepted. Although Dower employed it in 2009, William James used the term pacificism in 1910 to describe his rejection of militarism. The shorter term pacifism has become more common in English usage to describe a variety of views that are critical of war. Generally, pacifism is thought to be a principled rejection of war and killing. Oddly enough, terminology related to pacifism has occasionally been used to describe a pragmatic commitment to using war to create peace. Thus, a term like pacification can be employed in military usage to describe a violent process of suppressing violence, as when an enemy territory is quote-unquote pacified by killing or disabling the enemy. While George Orwell complained about such euphemistic descriptions of violence, The just war tradition does hold that war can be a suitable means to bring about peace. Despite these complications, pacifism generally connotes a commitment to making peace that rejects violent means for obtaining this end. One reason to reject violent means is the fact that might does not make right. That's how anarchism is defined, by the way, in Anarcho-Christian Atheist Polytheism, a interfaith framework on Substack you should all try. While violence can destroy an enemy, victory does not amount to justification. Pacifism, as it is understood in ordinary discourse today, includes a variety of commitments on a continuum from an absolute adherence to nonviolence in all actions to a more focused or minimal sort of anti-warism. In contrast to the just war tradition, pacifism rejects war as an acceptable means for obtaining peace. Pacifists will often refuse to serve in the military, and some refuse to support political and social systems that promote war by, for example, withholding their taxes. Pacifists have been associated with quietistic withdrawal from political life and even outright anarchism. Now here, they're kind of strawmanning anarchism. Anarchism is the thesis that might is not right that they just mentioned above. That is anarchism. But pacifists need not be passive. Many committed pacifists have been actively involved in nonviolent social protest. Pacifism can be used to describe a commitment to nonviolence in one's personal life that might include the attempt to cultivate pacific virtues such as tolerance, patience, mercy, forgiveness, and love. It might also be extended to include nonviolence toward all sentient beings, and thus result in a commitment to vegetarianism and what Albert Schweitzer called reverence for life. Pacifism can be connected to a larger project of spiritual transformation, as in Gandhi's commitment to ahimsa or nonviolence. And as the author of the present entry has argued, pacifism can be understood as offering a comprehensive normative framework. Here's the table of contents, folks. Take it in. You always want to X-ray a book, as they teach you in How to Read a Book, which is a great book. I should add it to the Golden Code curriculum. How do you read a table like this, top level down? 1. Defining peace. 2. Varieties of pacifism. 3. Consequentialist pacifism. 4. Deontological pacifism. 5. Religious and cultural basis. 6. Objections to pacifism and possible replies. 1. Defining peace. Pacifism is the broad commitment to making peace. The idea is complicated by the fact that peace is a family resemblance term. There are many varieties of peace. Peace is easiest to define dialectically as the opposite of war or violence. Pacifism has thus been described simply as anti-warism or as a commitment to nonviolence. One conceptual difficulty here is that when peace is defined negatively, pacifism appears as a reactionary response to war and violence. Discussions of peace thus often employ negative terms and create neologisms to express the concept of peace. Non-violence, non-war, non-killing, non-conflict, or non-war. Peace advocates will, however, insist that peace should be understood as a primary concept connected to cooperation, harmony, and positive human relations, and that is a mistake to understand peace in merely negative terms. At any rate, peace scholarship has long emphasized the distinction between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of violence or war, while positive peace encompasses cooperative, tranquil, and harmonious relations and the broader concerns of human flourishing and integration. A related distinction is that between what Sims et al. Call quote-unquote personal peacefulness, involving small groups of people, and peace at a larger international scale, up to and including quote-unquote world peace. When pacifism is defined as anti-warism, we encounter the difficulty of defining war. War is usually thought of as violence between states, or more broadly speaking, political communities, but the term war can also be applied to violent conflicts among individuals, as in Hobbes's idea that the state of nature is a state of war. All against all, he says. I would say there he's his usage is parasitic on the state versus state concept, I think. But similarly, although peace is usually thought of as political condition of amicable relations between states, terms like peace or peaceful can also be used to describe a relation between individuals or even a person's state of mind. If pacifism is defined as a commitment to nonviolence, we encounter the same problem of definition. Violence usually has a normative value and is defined as something like an unjustified injury or harm, but it is possible to speak of justified violence as in the just war theory. And so, the normative value of violence remains an open question. The concept of violence can also be extended metaphorically and used as an adjective, violent, to mean something like unbridled, uncontrolled, rough, or intense. Thus we speak of violent storms or violent emotions. That's not the same as violence. A commitment to nonviolence is at least a commitment to avoiding unjustified intentional injury. Pacifists will tend to think that most intentionally caused harms are unjustifiable. But the ideal of nonviolence might be extended to include the idea of controlling rough and intense emotions. In his essay, Journey to Nonviolence, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. claimed that a commitment to nonviolence required overcoming the quote-unquote internal violence of hatred and anger by cultivating love and compassion. There are a variety of possibilities for thinking about the nature of peace and thus for understanding what pacifism aims at creating. 1.1 Peace as slavery or submission. Peace can result from submission to power, and war can end with unconditional surrender. Rousseau maligned this sort of peace, calling it the peace of Ulysses and his comrades imprisoned in the cave of the Cyclops and waiting their turn to be devoured. We might claim that absolute rule and absolute submission produce a sort of peace, but this is peace conjoined with injustice, so it is clear that the sort of peace that is worth pursuing is peace that is also linked to justice. The idea of justice is at the heart of the just war tradition, which claims that we are entitled to fight back against injustice. As Patrick Henry asked in his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? One might claim that the peace of the Cyclops cave is not peace at all, but a state of war. Most pacifists will claim that the false peace of slavery is not what they have in mind. Rather, for the majority of pacifists, pacifism is not simply acquiescing passively to evil. Pacifism is not passivism. Rather, pacifism involves actively but non-violently resisting evil. Nonetheless, some pacifists, such as Tolstoy, do appear to advocate non-resistance. Tolstoy said, for example, "The only means of deliverance from violence is the submissive and peaceful endurance of it." Non-resistant pacifists in the Christian tradition often base the idea of submitting to evil on Jesus' ideas as expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not resist one who is evil, and love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Some Christian martyrs take this ideal seriously and look to Jesus' life and execution as a model of pacific virtue. I'll mention, by the way, that in the interfaith framework I mentioned in the description later, Christianity is defined as Christ is good, not as Christ is real or God. That's besides the point when it comes to this, for sure, pacifism. It's really the question of the moral lesson of the story is historicity or divinity of it. Anyway, 1.2, peace as modus vivendi or truce. The dialectical definition of peace as the absence of war can encompass the idea of the armed peace of the Cold War. Peace as the absence of war may be a mere modus vivendi in which armed opponents refrain from attacking one another out of fear. This sort of peace is the peace of a truce or stalemate. While it is true that in such conditions there is no overt damage done, the opponents have not been reconciled and hostile intentions have not been eliminated. Some may claim that the best we can do to make peace is to reach a state of détente that is made possible by mutual deterrent force. Related to this is what might be called, following Raymond Aron, peace by impotence or peace by exhaustion. In this sort of peace, the antagonistic parties are simply no longer willing to fight. Hostile intentions may persist, but the will to fight can no longer be actualized. Kant rejected this sort of peace, claiming that peace means an end to all hostilities. This is why Kant maintains that the first principle of perpetual peace is that states should not make, quote-unquote, secret reservation of the material for future war, unquote. Compare that to the Kremlin's position that there is no peacetime in information war. Vlad. Those who call themselves pacifists will usually agree with Kant that a mere modus vivendi produced by impotence or exhaustion is not actually peace, since hostile intent remains. And pacifists will argue that the peace of deterrence and détente are not really peace either, because they are the result of an increase in armaments and the threat of escalating violence. 1.3 Peace of a just and tranquil order. Opposed to peace as modus vivendi is what Aron calls peace by satisfaction. This is a peace that results from a lack of grievances and hostility. In the history of the West, this sort of peace is often linked to what Augustine called the tranquility of order. In recent Western thought, this idea often follows Kant in claiming that liberal democracy is the key to such a tranquil order. Francis Fukuyama's Hegelian idea about the end of history, for example, that didn't last long, hoped that the end of the Cold War would bring about the end of war in general as liberal democracy spread. Similarly, Michael Doyle has claimed that democracies do not go to war with one another. John Rawls has explained the stability of well-ordered democratic states as follows: there is a peace among them because all societies are satisfied with the status quo for the right reasons. More recently, this idea about the stabilizing and peacemaking power of democracy has influenced neoconservative ideas in U.S. foreign policy, where the hope is that peace will occur as democracy is spread. The idea that peace is founded in a just political order is connected to the ideas of the just war tradition from Augustine to Walzer. Defenders of the just war tradition from Augustine to Walzer argue that occasionally it is necessary to make war in order to establish such a tranquil and just social condition. More recent defenders of the just war idea have argued that interventionist wars should be fought in order to create stable conditions by defending human rights. Pacifists will disagree with those who claim that wars should be fought in pursuit of the ideal of a just and stable social order. Proponents of humanitarian intervention maintain that suitable means for attaining the goal of respect for human rights and satisfaction of human needs. But pacifists will argue that only non-violent means are coherent within these intended ends. Point 4. Positive peace. Positive definitions of peace go beyond merely dialectical definitions of peace as the opposite of war, and instead focus on peace as a state of rest, wholeness, or completion. The peace of a just and tranquil order points towards something like a condition of wholeness in which there is solidarity, mutual respect, and satisfaction of needs. In this vision of peace, there is genuine community and human flourishing. This includes not only the absence of direct violence, but also the absence of structural violence. The concept of structural violence has been widely discussed in recent years in connection with racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. Structural violence involves very generally practices and institutions that undermine human flourishing and create social tension. One central concern from the standpoint of positive peace is the project of criticizing and remediating structural violence. This may include what Lewin has called emancipatory peace, peace related to liberation or emancipation from structures of oppression. This also includes the work of peace education as well as work on nonviolent conflict resolution and mediation. Related concerns point toward the importance of justice with a special focus on restorative justice and community building. However, recent work in the field of peace studies has argued that positive peace is both too broad and too vague to be of use for empirical work in peace studies. The worry is that the notion of positive peace includes a broad range of social and political concerns, equality, economic justice, environmental sustainability, and so on, that stray from the core idea of peace as the absence of direct violence. Despite this criticism, the notion of positive peace remains in use. The positive ideal of peace can be found in religious conceptions of peace. Stanley Hauerwas has explained that some Christian pacifists claim that the concept of shalom, Hebrew for peace, is focused on positive peace. It is more than the absence of war, rather it is harmony, health, and well-being in all human relations. Shamir Mondagal maintains that something similar is found in Islam, where salam is more than the absence of war. It also requires the presence of justice and an atmosphere that promotes self-actualization. In some traditions, this appears to point beyond the merely political realm and aim toward spiritual transformation. In Christian context, this is related to the peace of God that surpasses all understanding, as in the Philippians 4.7. In Buddhism, this is related to the idea propounded by Thich Nhat Hanh of being peace that is connected to Buddhist practice. The Dalai Lama claims that peace is more than the absence of war, and he connects his vision of world peace to peacefulness as a state of mind. Quote unquote, peace is a state of tranquility founded on the deep sense of security that arises from mutual understanding, tolerance of others' point of view, and respect for their rights. This is closely related to the ideal of social stability, but the Dalai Lama also connects it to the deeper process of personal transformation. 1.5. Peace as a virtue and intrinsic value. Building upon these ideas, Michael Fox has described peace as a way of life. A peaceful way of life will be such as to incorporate nonviolence toward oneself and others, and will be guided by cooperation, mutual respect, creative problem solving, negotiation of differences, and caring concern or compassion. This conception of peace is not mere quietism or passivity. J. McDaniel, 2005, has argued in favor of a notion of quote-unquote creative peace, in which there is attention and activity as individuals and cultures must learn to listen and interact with one another. This notion of peace as a way of life can be understood in connection with virtue ethics, where peacefulness is understood as a virtue that is connected to other virtues such as modesty, tolerance, and mercy. Virtue ethics is discussed further below. As we conclude this consideration of what peace means in pacifism, it is important to note that pacifists often view peace as an end in itself, or as having a kind of intrinsic value. That's a typo. This is expressed in a variety of ways by pacifists. Pope Francis has said, for example, peace alone is holy. Peace alone is holy, not war. This idea has roots in Augustine, who says in The City of God that peace is the summum bonum. This is connected to Augustine's idea that we should only go to war if we are aiming at peace. Of course, that idea is central to the just war tradition that develops after Augustine. Pacifists have responded by arguing that there ought to be a unity of means and ends, and stipulating that only nonviolent means may be employed in pursuit of peace. This notion of peace as the summum bonum has been developed in Islamic thought by Wahidin Khan, who suggests that peace is like the soil that provides a foundation for all other good things. This conception of peace as having intrinsic value helps explain how pacifists may respond to the question of what peace is good for. Opposite of the James Brown question. Nobody ever asked this one. If peace is conceived as having intrinsic value, it is not good for anything else. It is simply good in itself. In understanding peace in this way, pacifists may rely on a kind of intuitionism that holds that peace and its value are known through a kind of moral intuition. Well, at the very least. Fiala has developed this account of pacifist metaethics, building on work in pacifist metaethics done by Holmes. Those who hold that peace is an end in itself with intrinsic value may question the idea that peace should be understood in instrumental terms. For example, some will argue that peace is good because it produces prosperity. Looks like Steven Pinker says that. But for pacifists who hold that peace has intrinsic value, we should not. That's also a typo. We should not pursue peace because it leads to prosperity. Rather, we ought to pursue peace for its own sake. Positive peace can be best understood from the tradition of virtues, where peacefulness is understood as a virtue that is connected to other virtues such as modesty, tolerance, and mercy. It is important to note that peace is not mere quietism, excuse me, and the passivity of meditation or contemplation. J. McDaniel has argued in favor of a notion of creative peace, in which there is tension and activity, as individuals and cultures must learn to listen and interact with one another. Tune in tomorrow for Section 2.